Hello, everyone. All right, I see folks are on the chat. Can everyone hear me? Cool. I'm getting yeses that folks can hear me. Can folks see me? Can folks see people? Okay, cool. This is we'll approach it. This is the voice of Omid Bagheri, Director of Equity and Community Partnership at Just Lead Washington. I'm going to introduce our two wonderful trainers today for our topic, microaggressions, what to know and how to navigate them. Before we jump in, I'm just going to share a little bit about Reggie. For those who don't know, the Washington Race Equity and Justice Initiative is a community of legal law and justice partners who have acknowledged and are committing to doing anti-racist work in Washington State, across Washington State, across civil legal aid and juvenile justice, criminal and juvenile justice sectors of the law and justice system. We do this work knowing that the law and justice system has been racialized, and that is our responsibility as part of these systems to do our work and to discover what our work is so we can truly move forward and collectively practice and advance race equity. So in that line, our topic today is specifically about microaggressions. Our trainers are going to talk about all the different ways that looks, but really it comes in the context of all the different ways our organizations and our systems can operate inequitably. And this happens in one way through microaggressions. And they're going to talk about racial microaggressions and otherwise. So with that said, I'm going to let our two trainers introduce themselves, and you'll no longer hear this voice without a face. Thank you all, and please, before we fully dive in, make sure you know where the chat box is, and we've already done our checks to see if folks can hear and see us. So if at any point there's any technical troubleshooting issues, please just share in the chat box. I am on deck on the chat to field any questions. And if you have any questions for the trainers on the content, you can also click on the Q&A icon. It should be at the top or bottom of your screen, and you can pose your question there. And we'll try and we're going to make time for questions at the end of the session. So with that said, I'm going to hand it off to our two trainers.
Thanks, Omid. We are so excited to be here today.
Yes, absolutely.
Before we get going with who we are, we'd like to, but I can do that while you're doing that. Okay, great. We'd like to just acknowledge the land that we're on. We don't often talk about this, and I want to meaningfully do it before we talk about ourselves, so that we have this front and center in our minds as we're having our discussion today. We don't often talk about the genocide of Native American people and the fact that that's why we are where we are. Here in Seattle, we're on the land of the Duwamish. My home, which is in Shoreline, is on the land of the Snohomish and the Puget Sound Salish tribes. And Omid in a second here is gonna type into the chat box websites that you can go to. So if you're not sure whose land you're on, from wherever you're coming to us, you can go ahead and click on that link and you can type in your zip code, and that'll tell you which indigenous land you're on. If folks do know which land they're on and you're on land besides the Duwamish, would you just do us a favor and type into the chat box? We'll just call a few of those out before we move along. Okay. Definitely gonna butcher this one. S-Q-U-A-X-I-N. Squaxin, the Ohlone, the traditional lands of the Spokanes. Spokane tribe, Yakima, Lenape and Wapinger, And again, please excuse how awfully I'm going to butcher these names, not being from these areas. Sana. Olin, another one. Right on. Cool. Bookmark that website so that you can send it off to other folks too. And if you are someone who does presentations and you want to help other folks to know what land they're on, then feel free to include that in your presentation. Thanks all for participating. Here's some more. Delaware. And I am myself Potawatomi. Nice. Sending love to all my fellow Indigenous lawyers. Right on. Awesome. Thank you. Right on. Sweet and Miami. Cowlitz. Right on. Folks coming from a lot of different areas.
Omi Vigera here, the voice without a face.
Yes.
If on the chat box, if you would like to send your message to all attendees of the webinar, see that little drop-down menu. Make sure you hit all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, we will get it, and we will do our best to repeat back chat messages that come through. But if you would like to share with all, please make sure you hit all attendees as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Omid. It's not working for some reason. Just a second. Cool. All right. So who the heck are we? My name is Lori Carlson, and I was a Just Lead Fellow in 2014, which is how I got connected to this wonderful organization and to Reggie. And I am right now an independent consultant with an organization called Reverb DEI that I founded. So these are the kinds of trainings that I do most of the time with nonprofit and for-profit businesses alike. And I am so pleased to have my very good friend KJ here, and she will introduce herself too.
Yes, so thank you and welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be with you today. So I am KJ Williams, and most recently I was the Diversity Programs Manager at the State Bar Association, almost 9 years doing that work within the context of the legal profession. I have an undergrad in urban studies and a graduate degree in public administration, both of which have served me pretty well. In the last year, I have launched my own company, which is called RISE, Radical Insightful Solutions to Creating Equity. I am the founder and owner of that, and I'm also a Just Lead consultant and leadership coach. And I was in the third cohort, which I believe was 2015, I think, because you were second. No, wait, no, we were in the same cohort. Okay, so 2015. Time does fly when you're having fun, doesn't it? All right, yes. So excited to be here today and to chat with all of you. All right, so we're going to jump right in. These are our learning goals for today. The discussion framework will really spend some time thinking about how we come to this work and the process that we use to find ourselves in this work. We'll discuss what microaggressions are. There are 3 types of microaggressions, and how microaggressions show up within us and within our sphere of influence. And how do we respond to those microaggressions when we find ourselves either as a bystander or someone who has committed some microaggressive language or behavior. So we'll talk about how to respond to that, how to recover.
Yeah. Right. Before we go into our discussion framework, we're going to ask you a poll question. So look for that on your screens and answer for us if you would. We'll start calling out some answers. Right on. Okay, someone's already clicked. I'm not exactly sure what a microaggression is, so don't be shy about it. This is partly how we're going to know how deeply we need to go into definitions, where we're going to spend most of our time today. I'll note that we have a lot of slides today for an hour and a half. So we will go fairly quickly through some of them. Some of them we might not even get to touch on, but we want you to have this material. So we'll be sending out the slides afterwards. So don't be stressed if you see a slide fly by that you really want to dig into. You'll get to see it later on. All right, looks like most people, yes, have experienced a microaggression in the last week. And a fair number, yeah, going on 20%, aren't exactly sure enough what it is to say that they have or haven't experienced it. And are you aware of having committed a microaggression in the last week? Looks like most people are not, which isn't surprising, honestly. A lot of times we are committing our microaggressions out of privilege, and privilege is a really tough thing to be aware of. And we're not always called out on our microaggressions. So yeah, it's not surprising that most folks aren't aware of having. It doesn't mean we haven't. I'm sure I have this week and haven't known it. All right. So yeah, fair number of people out there aren't super sure what a microaggression is, which is great. We're going to go into that a little bit here. But first, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the framework. How do we come to this discussion? Often people will ask, can you teach me how to not commit microaggressions? And to that question I say, no, I really can't. There are many things, including the fact that we've grown up in a culture that teaches us in dominant culture ways and teaches us a lot of things that are not true that we internalize about different groups of people. So there are things that my grandfather said constantly while I was growing up that are still just deep in my brain. And once in a while, if I'm tired, something's going to come out. And no matter how long I work on social justice or even racial justice, I'm never going to be able to uproot all of those biases that are in there. So instead, what we're going to talk about today is how to navigate when we do commit microaggressions. How do I move past? How do I repair relationships? Those sorts of things. So if you came to this webinar thinking, I need a checklist so that nothing that's offensive comes out of my mouth ever, I'm sorry to disappoint you. But we will talk a lot about how to navigate. We lead this conversation with a racial justice lens. In the chat box, can someone tell me why you think that might be? Why might we lead this through a racial justice lens, even though we're going to talk about a lot of other marginalized identities today and how those impact microaggressions? Anyone have thoughts on that? I'll start out with a couple reasons, but feel free to type in some of your own. Race is the thing we don't want to talk about. It's the last thing we choose to talk about often. So that we don't miss talking about it, I like to frame it right up front and make sure that we get there. Also, if you look at statistics, we see that no matter what other identities you have, if you're a person of color, you're not faring well. Statistically speaking, the amount of money that Black people make in to a white man's dollar is very, very low. The number of people incarcerated. So we use these statistics to look at the fact that we're not doing very well in race. So if we center it, we will make sure that we're addressing it. Race is one of the largest and most significant bases of oppression. Absolutely. Yep. Race is fundamental in America's great shame. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I would add also that it's of a necessity that we lead these types of conversations through the lens of race when we understand the historical context of our country and the development of all of our systems, our institutions, and our processes, that they are all racialized. And so if we're going to have a discussion about how to reduce or mitigate oppression and being marginalized, then we have to start with the largest, most challenging political and social construct, and that is race.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, thank you for all of your contributions here in the chat box. So we are taught to think that we are either a racist or we're not. We're either homophobic or we're not. It's really important that we challenge this dichotomous thinking because this isn't actually how it plays out. And one of my favorite videos around racial justice is by Jay Smooth. We're going to watch another of his videos today, but he has a video wherein he compares how we think about racism to getting your tonsils removed. So he says, I couldn't possibly be racist. I got my prejudice removed in 1986. right? And when really what we're talking about is more of a dental hygiene issue. So just like you brush your teeth every day, you wake up in the morning and say, what am I doing today that's racist? How do I become more anti-racist? And really tend to these pockets of prejudice that I have. So I'm stealing that straight up from Jay Smooth. There's a video called How I Stopped Worrying About Talking About Race and Learned to Love It. So check that out on YouTube. It's an awesome video if you haven't seen it yet.
All right, so we are going to jump right into how microaggressions come out of implicit bias. So if you take a look at the screen, look at the picture and the soil, you consider the soil being your mind. And with the understanding that in terms of the way our brain works, we take in up to 11 million bits of information in any given moment, and we are only consciously aware of 40 of them. Now, as we're taking that information in, we're not taking that information in within a vacuum. Right? There are narratives, there are social norms, there are messages, there are stereotypes that are attached to all the information that we take in. And when that happens, there is a process that our brain continues to go through. And that process means that we will ultimately interact or react without our even thinking about it. And so when we look at the definition of implicit bias, those attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, decision making, and behavior without our even realizing it, again, looking at this picture, the soil is the brain. The seeds that are planted in the soil is that information that we're taking in. And what pollinates that soil, what fertilizes that soil are the narratives that come along with those seeds. And out of those narratives, the seeds can burst forth with those attitudes or stereotypes. And so we may very well speak without thinking about it and say something that comes out as a microaggression. And there doesn't have to be intentionality around that. But the key here is to recognize that while all of us are subjected to implicit bias, and implicit bias is both challenging as well as positive, it's a necessary function of the brain to help us know where to go, who to speak to, what's safe and what's not safe. When we get to the place where we are speaking without taking time to think, we're more likely to say those things that can be microaggressive in our language or in our behavior. And so this is why we say that microaggressions can come out of our implicit bias. Recognizing again that our biases are generally developed early on in life, and that our family of origin has a great deal to do with the biases that we develop, both the positive and those challenging biases. We're not calling those things either right or wrong. It's just a fact. This is just the way that that we operate. So what are microaggressions, and what do they matter, and why do they matter? So there are three types of microaggressions. There's the micro-assault, there's the micro-invalidation, and there's the micro-insult. Now, the microaggressions, we don't have, I'm looking for the, where do we get to the definition?
You want to do that first?
Yeah, we should go there right there. Yep, those are the three types of microaggressions. Let's move to the, oh, before we go there. Sorry, folks. I want to go over the definition of the microaggression. So Chester Pierce, African-American Harvard psychiatrist, first coined this term late 1960s, early 1970s. You think about the social and political context of the time, and that women and people of color, predominantly African Americans, were fighting for their civil rights. And as he's doing research and looking for ways to articulate the experiences of these particular groups, he comes up with this term microaggressions. You fast forward about 30 some years, and we have a reintroduction of the term. There we go. I'm going to get the buttons right soon here, folks. We have a reintroduction of the term by Dr. Daryl W. Sue, brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities. Now, the key is that between this time, the 1970s to mid to late 2000s, although we don't see the term microaggressions, what we do recognize is that when you do an analysis of the literature and the research during that time, that the same experiences were being articulated. They were just using different terminology. And so while the term microaggressions may seem like it's new, the experience that underpins microaggressions is not new at all. All right, so the three types of microaggressions, again, the micro-assault, the micro-invalidation, and the micro-insult. Now, the micro-assault, this is something that we would refer to as old-fashioned racism. It's in your face, it's intentional, it's purposeful. An example of a micro-assault would be my wife and I were driving down I-5 and we were in a vehicle and we had just left Seattle, so we're on the way home. We're in the HOV lane and we have an older white gentleman in another vehicle about 2 lanes over who seems to be trying to get our attention. And my wife says, roll down the window and see what's going on. Maybe he's trying to say that something is wrong with our car. And so we do that, and unfortunately what we experience is some very unhealthy and unkind language that was coming from him around our sexuality, around our orientation, around the fact that we were Black. And so these are the things that was intentional, right? He drove next to us long enough to get our attention so that he could intentionally say things that were oppressive and that were exclusionary and marginalizing. And so that's an example of a micro assault. If you have any questions about any of these types of microaggressions, please let us know that in the chat. So the micro insult, subtle snubs, often unconscious, convey hidden insulting message, demeaning, and can occur non-verbally. One of the examples that I like to use for the micro insult is to think back to what your experience was in middle school. Now, for the majority of us, middle school was the place where we really began to learn about oh my gosh, cliques and you know, do we fit in? What do we need to do to fit in? And so there is a way that you know, both boys and girls use without words to convey that you're not wanted, you're not welcomed. And a micro insult can take that kind of form. For example, going into the lunchroom and trying to figure out where to sit, right? If you're not the super popular person, or if you weren't connected to a particular group. And so students didn't have to tell you verbally that they didn't want you to sit with them. They could turn their backs or they wouldn't make eye contact, right? And this is all because there was something about you, something about your identity that was not invited or wanted. And so that's just one example of a micro insult. Do you have an example of a micro insult that you'd like to share?
No, I think that's great.
All right.
Yeah.
We're going to move on then to the micro invalidation. The example of the micro invalidation that I like to use is, so I can use Lori, for example. So let's say that Lori and I are in conversation and I'm trying to explain to her some of the experiences that I'm having as a Black woman. Excuse me. And what she says to me in return is, well, you know, I just like you because you're my friend, and I was raised in a particular manner by my parents to accept everyone, and I am a lover of human beings. I am someone who doesn't see color, I don't see ethnicity or race. Those things are not important to me. Your disability doesn't matter to me. The only thing that matters to me is that you are a human being just like I am, and you're a good person, and that's the place that I like to operate from. I've heard this over and over again, not from Lori, but again, this is just an example. And
only because you've only known me for the last 10 years.
Right. So the reality, though, is that if Lori were to actually say that to me, my response to her would be something like, without really understanding and accepting the reality of my life as a Black woman, then we don't have an authentic relationship. We can't have an authentic friendship. And that means that I can't actually share with you the challenges of navigating systems and relationships and just the social environment as a Black woman. And so that kind of blindness to the reality of my multiple identities that are target identities, if you're not going to acknowledge those things, then we can't actually connect authentically. And so you're invalidating my reality and invalidating the truth of who I am and all the identities that make me who I am.
Can I share another way
Yes,
that can look?
do that.
I'm definitely guilty of having done before.
Please.
KJ might say to me, oh God, the other day, I had my hand up in this meeting. I had something really important I wanted to say, and they called on every white person in the room and never called on me. And I might be tempted to say, oh, I don't think that was because you're Black. I think that they must not have seen your hand. Right? I think, you know, you need to give them the benefit of the doubt, KJ.
Raise my hand higher.
Right? So this is another thing that people with privilege do.
Absolutely.
Is to question the reality of marginalized individuals who are experiencing microaggressions.
Absolutely.
You have one question from the chat box.
Great.
Question is, when a white woman reaches out to touch my hair without permission because it's so quote unquote different, what kind of microaggression is that?
It's a wonderful question. What would you say, KJ?
Well, I would say that actually it doesn't fall cleanly into any specific type of microaggression. That for me, in my perspective, it touches on all three of them. In some ways, it's a micro assault because it's intentional. She did not ask for permission, and it's an invasion of personal space. It's a micro insult in that there is this assumption that you have the right to invade my space, to touch my body, and to make comments without any type of relationship with me. And that is insulting. It's insulting to me as a human being and just my personal space, right? In terms of the micro invalidation, again, this I feel as though comes from a place of privilege, and that you're invalidating my right, again, as a human being to have that space, and the fact that you need to ask for permission before you invade my space and you take it upon yourself to physically touch me.
Great question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So some of the psychological consequences of having experienced microaggressions are listed on the screen here. And, you know, there definitely was an example, or is an example that I can share with this. Having worked in an organization many, many years ago, and having a conversation with someone who was a white supervisor of mine, and let's see, how do I want to put this forward? having a conversation around her lack of competency in a particular area where my competency was very strong, and being told, I really want to hear truthfully what your experience is and the things that I can do to make changes, and me believing that, and then me speaking very truthfully, but from a place of compassion and kindness, but still speaking that truth, and recognizing pretty shortly thereafter that she actually couldn't handle that level of truth, and then began to act out microaggressively towards me throughout the rest of my tenure. And what the result of that was that I began to experience many of these things, because we would go into meetings, I would be ignored, I would be left off of important emails, and so I experienced a lot of targeting. And so it took me a while before I began to clue in that this actually was going to be the environment that I had to navigate, because I was in a place where I could not find another position because I had some other things that were going on at the time. And so that resulted in me in my anxiety levels going through the roof, diminished confidence. She would walk into the room. If I was doing a presentation, I would literally begin to stutter. I would lose my train of thought, and the depression began to take hold and affect my executive functioning. And so these are just, this is not an exhaustive list. This is a representative list of some of the psychological consequences experienced by those who are on the receiving end of microaggressions on a pretty consistent basis. And then we have the health outcomes, being treated with less courtesy than others, being treated with less respect. Now, we do know, you can do the research yourself as well, that the health outcomes are real for those who are the recipients of microaggressions. And I think when we look at those groups that are targeted, those that are underrepresented and underserved, that this statement actually is supported when we look at the research, when we statistically we look at the disparate outcomes for health for people of color. And so that's something to keep in mind, that if you yourself are in an environment where you're constantly being subjected to microaggressions, that it's not just your mental health that's being impacted, it is also your physical health, because those things work hand in hand.
We got one question from the chat. Question is it still considered a microaggression when it comes from someone of your same race?
Great question.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, absolutely. And remember that we're talking about racial microaggressions. That's how we started out this webinar. But microaggressions cover the gamut. And going back to those definitions between Chester A. Pierce and then Daryl W. Sue, you see that Dr. Sue expanded microaggressions to include people, sexual orientation, religion, ability, or able-bodiedness. And so we can all commit microaggressions, and we all do, as Lori mentioned earlier. Whether consciously or unconsciously, we're all subjected to being the perpetrators of microaggressions as well as the recipients, regardless of race, class, gender, or any other identity.
I'll give you a short example. My wife and I just had a child. I carried the child, and when she was about 3 months old, a couple came up and asked us who the mother was. And I said, we're both the mother. But then for some reason I felt the need to say, but I'm the birth mom. Hurt the heck out of my wife, right? And we had to talk about it for a while. That's microaggression, and it came out because of the heteronormativity that I've lived with for my entire life, right? I didn't do it on purpose. I didn't mean to hurt my wife or seem better than her or more connected to our child, but these are the things that happen because we're human and we've grown up in this society.
Yeah, that's a great example. All right, is this our video?
Yeah, we have a little
This is a great video. You guys are gonna love it. Sums up the microaggressions.
Yeah, type your reactions into the chat box.
Yes,
after
and
we
it's
watch it.
entirely fine to laugh, folks. It's okay.
Absolutely.
For
Or be
people
mad.
who still
It makes you
don't.
mad. Absolutely.
We can usually get to the anger quicker than we can get to the joy sometimes,
Yeah,
especially around these discussions.
Very true.
Don't think that microaggressions are a problem?
Oh, you're so well spoken.
Oh, just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
It's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while...
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland.
Sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date...
Oh, your hair was so good.
Excuse me? Going grocery shopping.
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
Commuting to work.
So when are you gonna have a baby?
Watching TV.
We have to keep the Redskins' name. It's part of our culture and history.
Or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Shopping is like a bad match here too.
I'm getting bit by mosquitoes every goddamn day.
Touch your hair.
Multiple times a day.
Can I touch your hair? Can I
It's fucking annoying. It makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes. Which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
Let's just Just a mosquito bite, who cares?
Just another angry black woman.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try this challenging major.
Ow, my dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
He looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
Do you want to read some of our comments there for us, Omid? Have some good ones coming in.
One comment was the amount of times I've been told, I guess in reference to an earlier example of a microaggression, that in court or being confused for the interpreter instead of the attorney, as the commenter was saying, that's happened many a time, and that it's better to just laugh at it, or at least is the way to get through that moment. Someone else shared that they've been confused for their client multiple times. Even had opposing counsel not believe me when I said I am an attorney. Someone else commented that they walk with their ID visible in court, so they don't get yelled at when they sit in the front row where the attorneys are meant to sit. And the last comment here I'll share is I've seen some folks that have agent rank, or privilege rather, say that they experience microaggressions from those who are targets, which seems kind of like a quote-unquote reverse racism move and like a micro-invalidation, like a man saying, quote-unquote, women complain that I'm being sexist, end quote, is a microaggression.
That's deep. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Speaking of agent rank, I'm glad you brought that up, because we're going to go into, yes, a little bit about identity, and we want you all to, oops, did not mean to do that. Going, whoops.
Well,
sorry.
We're not going to watch bloopers.
No, we're not. Apologies. We're figuring out our. There we go. So we're going to ask you all to think a little bit about your identity. We've been mentioning intersectionality and other identities besides race throughout our presentation so far, but we're really going to dig in now and take a specific look at identity. And we'd love for you to check this out. This is called the addressing model. It comes from Pamela Hayes, but was adapted by Leticia Nieto, who has a book called Beyond Inclusion, Beyond Empowerment that you should definitely check out if you have not. And the agent and rank are, or the agent and target, thank you, target language is hers. So what I would love for you to do is take a look here on this chart and just identify yourselves in these two different categories. So there's social identity on the left-hand side, and then there are two categories, marginalized and privileged. And I'd love for you to just take a look down and mentally identify yourself on this list. And then we have another poll question for you here, which is, which privileged identity causes you to step in it the most? So I will share that my racial identity is probably the thing that causes me to step in it the most. I grew up in a very white community, in a very white family that taught me a lot of racism, in a very white school district that taught me a lot of racism through its curriculum. So I would say that that's the thing that's most ingrained in my subconscious. Yeah, oh, as an adult, yeah, that's the one that we don't think of a lot is the ageism that we have, and on either end, right? Like the way that we treat children and the way that we treat our elders can sometimes be very disrespectful and microaggressive. What else are you seeing, KJ?
Oh, well, white Euro-Americans, but the middle and owning class persons. That's what I was thinking about. I was going back and forth between my own privilege between being formally educated and being middle and owning class, and that those, from a privilege standpoint, are the ones that I think causes me to step into it the most. There's a particular narrative that I grew up with around education, and those that are not educated, or not those that do not access higher education specifically, as well as a narrative around the necessity of owning your own home and owning land, and what it means when you don't, and also the subtext to those people or groups that don't pursue the opportunity to own and to rise to the middle class. And so I know that that's a challenge for me continually.
Absolutely, yeah. Scott Wynn calls folks who are not traditionally educated the brilliant masses. He uses the example of his father, who's a farmer in Kansas and knows exactly which crops to plant and where to plant them and when. A lot of knowledge out there, a lot of wisdom that is not imparted through our educational system.
Yes.
So folks can now see the results now that we've closed the poll. So folks watching along, take a look at how you all responded.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Classism and racism, two things that our country is absolutely built on. 100%. I want to circle back to someone's question talking about reverse racism. Now that we have this nice chart that we can look at, it'll be a little bit easier to talk about this. We need a way to separate out offenses that are based on power dynamics. Right now we're talking about privilege and marginalization, and those that are not based on those power dynamics. So KJ could say something really mean to me. She could even say it about my race, right? But she doesn't have power over me from a societal perspective, right? People who look like me make all the laws in this land, right? People that look like KJ do not, right? So we need a different way to understand those interactions when KJ says something that's unkind to me, and when I say something to KJ that is connected to my ability to enact institutional violence against her or people who look like her. Yes. So that's how I approach the conversation about reverse racism. It's not a thing, because when we talk about racism, we need a way to separate what happens when someone who is part of the owning class and the people who make these laws in our country says something that's connected to violence versus when someone says something that's offensive that does not carry that weight.
We got one question here.
Let's hear it.
Question is, why is 64 the cutoff age for privilege?
That's an awesome question. Eileen, do you have, I don't remember anything from Nietzsche's materials. Do you know? Do you remember? Yeah. We're going to ask another brilliant mind who's here today, Eileen Carton-Lisfield, for some advice on this.
Hi, everyone. I would offer that disproportionately you have people who are retired, many people who are retired who are disproportionately low income, who are living off of, if they're lucky, on Social Security benefits, which is considerably low at best. And so it's a target population that tends to have so many vulnerabilities that folks who are in the middle group age range aren't subjected to in the same way. So there's a disproportionality at the moment.
All right, more to add?
No, that's fine.
All right, good question.
Thanks, Eileen.
Yeah, thank you, Eileen. All right. Thank you.
Oh.
Oops. Nope.
We
cannot skip intersectionality, of course. So we talked a little bit around intersectionality. It's a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw back in the 1990s. And we use it to apply to more than just Black women, which is how it was developed. Talking about the Black women, okay, the 80s, yes. The Black women's experience. But how we can think of it is really our different identities coming together and mitigating one another. So my queerness, I identify as a queer woman, is mitigated by my social class, because if we were pre-marriage equality right now and the child that I just birthed was not assumed to be my wife's because we're married, we would have to have a second parent adoption. That would not be any problem for us financially, but for someone who does not share my class culture, that might be a very limiting factor and create a big issue for them. So you see how either way, it can go either way. Do you want to share a little bit too about how your identities interact?
Yeah, so the way that I like to look at this is just recognizing I'm a woman. I identify as a female, although I am also out, and so I'm queer, but I am a Black woman. So it means something for me to navigate the world as a woman, but it means something different for me to navigate the world as a Black woman. And when you overlay that or intersect that with my queerness and then my age as well, my experience in the world is informed by those identities and how others respond to those identities. And some of those identities I just can't hide, right? So that's the way that I like to present it. And I think that Kimberly Crenshaw did a fabulous job in trying to help us understand how intersectionality is really about the compounded oppression that women, and especially Black women, as that was her target population at the time, were experiencing. So you want to go into global anti-Blackness or take that? So we add this global anti-Blackness because what we recognize is the phenomena that is global, and it's pretty simple. We know statistically, and we know this, so let me put it this way. We know quantitatively and qualitatively that the darker the hue of your skin, the more barriers and challenges you experience. And that's not just in this country, that is globally, and that is across racial and ethnic groups. But predominantly with groups of color.
Yep. Sometimes it goes and sometimes it doesn't.
Click it once and
then do it again. Okay.
All right, so now we're going to go into managing conflict. You might ask yourself, why are we talking about managing conflict when we are focused on discussing microaggressions? Well, the first time that you are interrupted, let's say that you engage in some type of microaggressive language or behavior, and someone else interrupts that behavior, it may actually feel like conflict to you. All right, and it's uncomfortable. In addition to that, let's say that you're a bystander and you are watching some type of microaggressive language or behavior take place, and you are thinking about how you want to respond or whether or not you want to interact. Again, that may feel like conflict. It may be a new situation, or maybe the individuals are people that you don't have a very deep relationship with, and so the risk is high, right? The cost is high. And so it's important to recognize that our body is going to respond to that situation in a particular manner, and it may respond as though you are in the midst of conflict. Now, conflict styles, it's really important to understand and recognize what your predominant conflict style is. So if we go back to your family of origin, just take a moment and think through what was the dominant conflict style in your home. Now, many families will navigate between these different types of styles, but often there's one dominant style. So we talk about avoiding, we're avoiding at all costs. We don't want to argue. We don't want to be in the midst of conflict. When we are discussing giving in, we are giving in so that we can keep the peace. So again, we can mitigate the conflict. When we look at standing your ground or competing, now this is mine. I can own that. This was my family of origin's dominant style. This is not even about the content of the argument anymore. This is about winning the argument. This is about winning. And then compromising, we're getting close to where we want to be, but not quite. In this type of compromising, you're still giving away more than you ought to give away. You walk away from the table, and it's not a win-win situation. Collaborating is where we want to be, but collaborating is extremely difficult. It takes definitely a depth of self-awareness and the ability to hold space for someone else and their differing opinions, thoughts, and perspectives. With collaborating, we want to be at the table until both of us walk away feeling as though it is truly a win-win situation, which may require us both to be willing to give up something, to rethink our paradigm, and to reframe the conversation. And so you should take a moment or take some time to think about what the dominant style of conflict was in your home and whether or not you've moved from that style. Have you done any work to move yourself along the continuum so that you are arming yourself with some different strategies to navigate conflict?
And now, we did just launch a poll, so you can actually indicate there. What did you learn in your family of origin? For me, it was avoidance.
You avoid and I stand my ground.
I know, right? Ooh, that's great.
That's great. That's awesome. That's awesome. Let's see, fight, peace.
Oh yes, sorry.
Oh,
this is from the next slide. Okay,
so I'm going to go ahead and go on to the next slide.
Do
Can I move this out of the way so I can? No,
yeah, I'll do it. No, I'll do it. There you go.
All right, next slide.
There we go.
So the poll actually refers to this slide, and this is more around the physiological response to conflict, and this is some of the, I mean, it's a physical aspect as well, but our body is going to respond to any situation that feels like conflict. And for some of us, our adrenaline really starts running, and we're getting ready for that fight, right? I'm getting ready to stand my ground. For others, like Lori, it's avoiding, right? So she's flight. She's in that flight mode. I'm going to do whatever I can to get the heck out of here. For some of us, it's freezing. We get completely flooded, and everything just goes still. And maybe the words aren't coming to us, and we're not thinking very clearly. For some of us, it is appeasing. Our whole body is saying, just do whatever you can, give whatever you need to give so that we can calm down and we can get back to a place of peace. And then for some others of us, you know, once the conflict starts, our brain is like, it's time to disconnect. I'm disassociating, and I am not really interested in remaining connected and working through this. And this is also a way to self-protect, right? I'm not going to engage. So let's see what the poll results are. So the
lawyers, a lot of fighters. That's surprising.
Appease. Well, appease is the top.
Yeah, you're right. It is, isn't it? 36,
fighting, 31%. Yeah. All right. I'm really surprised that flight is so low.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that dissociation though is real.
Oh, I can feel the numbness in my body sometimes when it happens.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like,
So we got a few questions.
Yeah, let's hear them.
First question is, would collaborating be something compulsory in a workplace, or would the compulsory piece be more quote unquote compromising?
Compulsory.
I think that is a good question. Give me the last end of that question again.
Or would the compulsory piece potentially in a workplace be more compromising?
Well, so if we think about this in the work context, if it's compulsory, then what I would suppose is that the organization has some type of policy or norm that requires you to sit at the table and to work things out until there is a win-win situation, right? So with the compromising though, if compromising is happening in the work context, frankly, that's not really healthy, because the compromising that we're talking about is that you're actually giving away more than you should. And so it's going to be, once you throw this into the work context, you've got to consider the policies of the organization, the structure of the organization, and the norms of the organization. Do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I feel like collaborating is sort of beyond how most of our organizations imagine, right? Like when we think about visioning this world that we want, one of those things is a collaborative workspace where we can all come to the table with our whole selves and treat each other as human beings. And I think that doesn't happen a lot, especially in the legal context, right? There's a lot of fear around lawsuits and human resources policies, and conflict gets worked through in that context. So I think of collaborating as sort of beyond what any of us have in our policies right now, and it's much more of a culture norm that we should be working toward in our organization.
Yeah, the other thing about collaborating in the workspace is, you know, you have to think about who's at the table, because positionality means a lot, right? What it means to collaborate in a professional environment when you are, let's say, the department director and you are collaborating with a manager from another department. Truly, what is that collaboration? What form is that collaboration taking, and what are the outcomes that you're looking for that are equitable? And I think that that can be challenging.
And one related question to collaboration we also have is wondering out loud if collaborations place an inordinate burden upon people of color to educate. Is that a possibility?
Yes.
I think it actually depends on what we're collaborating on. When we're talking about collaboration. Because in the context that we're discussing, we're saying that in the midst of conflict, we're going to collaborate so that there's a win-win situation. There is not an automatic, and should not be an automatic, expectation that the person of color or someone who has lower positionality or social ranking is doing the educating so that the collaboration process is equitable. We all have our own individual responsibility around that. Now, that's ideal. Right? The reality is that often people of color and others who are who have identities from other underrepresented groups or underserved groups often feel that burden, whether that's overtly articulated or not, that there's this underlying assumption that we're going to bring more information to the table so that things are better understood. And that's simply not our responsibility.
Yeah, I think I would reference the difference between equity and equality here, because if we're thinking about collaboration as 50-50, KJ is going to come 50% to the table and I'm going to come 50% to the table. Well, if we're talking about a microaggression that's happened, and I'm the microaggressor and I've said something racist, then I'm going to bring like 98.9% to the table, right? And I'm not going to do it by asking KJ, hey, can you tell me what was wrong with that? Can you give me some resources? I'm gonna find some other ways, and we have some slides on that coming up so that you know exactly what we're talking about.
Well, I actually have to respond to that, because I get this a lot in workshops, and I would say that the example that you just shared depends on the relationship with the person.
Absolutely.
Because with Lori, because I have a relationship with her, if she makes a microaggressive statement towards me, and I'm going to respond to that, if she genuinely doesn't understand what was microaggressive about it, then because I'm invested in the relationship, because we have a good relationship, and I want to continue that relationship, I'm actually going to say, well, here's the history behind that. But I would do that because I already know that she's open to that. And I don't know that we get that at the front end just with anyone else who is across the table. So it's about that relationship dynamic as well.
And I would caution my white folks out there to not make an assumption about how close your relationship is with a person of color. And it's really the person of color's decision.
That's right.
How invested they are. So, you know, we need to take care of our own stuff, and when our friends can show up for us, that's great, and when they can't, we need to really take ownership.
That's right. Absolutely.
So we got a few more questions that have come in. Do we want to dive in, or do we want to move on? And we can circle back
I'm
to the
feeling
question?
like I want to move us on. What do you think, KJ?
I think so.
What we really want to do is get you into this section where we can talk about how to respond. Yeah.
So we're going to come to questions soon, and then we'll finish out the questions that we have so far.
Let's skip that one. I think we can, McKinley. I don't see my clicker. Oh, on top of that. Okay. All right.
All right, we're going to watch another great video that I love.
All right, Jay Smooth, here we go.
Race, the final frontier. No matter what channel you watch, no matter what feed you aggregate, it seems like everybody everywhere is talking about race right now. And when everybody everywhere is talking about race, that means sooner or later you're going to have to tell somebody that they said something that sounded racist. So you need to be ready and have a plan in place for how to approach the inevitable "that sounded racist" conversation. And I'm going to tell you how to do that. The most important thing that you've got to do is remember the difference between the "what they did" conversation and the "what they are" conversation. Those are two totally different conversations, and you need to make sure that you pick the right one. The "what they did" conversation focuses strictly on the person's words and actions and explaining why what they did and what they said was unacceptable. This is also known as the "that thing you said was racist" conversation, and that's the conversation that you want to have. The "what they are" conversation, on the other hand, takes things one step further and uses what they did and what they said to draw conclusions about what kind of person they are. This is also known as the "I think you are a racist" conversation. This is the conversation you don't want to have, because that conversation takes us away from the facts of what they did and the speculation about their motives and intentions, and those are things you can only guess at, you can't ever prove, and that makes it way too easy for them to derail your whole argument. And that is the part that's crucial to understand. When you say "I think he's a racist," that's not a bad move because you might be wrong. That's a bad move because you might be right. Because if that dude really is racist, you want to make sure you hold him accountable and don't let him off easy. And even though intuitively it feels like the hardest way to hit him is just run up on him and say, "I think your ass is racist," when you handle it that way, you're actually letting him off easy because you're setting up a conversation that's way too simple for him to derail and duck out of. Just think about how this plays out every time a politician or a celebrity gets caught out there. It always starts out as a "what they did" conversation, but as soon as the celebrity and their defenders get on camera, they start doing judo flips and switching it into a "what they are" conversation. "I have known this person for years, and I know for a fact that they are not a racist, and how dare you claim to know what's inside their soul just because they made one little joke about watermelon tap dancing and going back to Africa." And then you try and explain that we don't need to see inside their soul to know that they shouldn't have said all that about the watermelon, and you try to focus on the facts of the situation, but by then it's too late because the "what they are" conversation is a rhetorical Bermuda Triangle where everything drowns in a sea of empty posturing until somebody just blames it all on hip-hop and we forget the whole thing ever happens. Don't let this happen to you. When somebody picks my pocket, I'm not going to be chasing him down so I can figure out whether he feels like he's a thief deep down in his heart. I'm going to be chasing him down so I can get my wallet back. I don't care what he is, but I need to hold him accountable for what he did. And that's how we need to approach these conversations about race. Treat them like they took your wallet and focus on the part that matters, holding each person accountable for the impact of their words and actions. I don't care what you are. I care about what you did.
Folks have reactions to the video? You can type them in the chat box here. We'll read some of them out. What did this get you thinking about? What questions do you have? Okay, all right, we're gonna move on then.
All right, so we had a question.
All right, there you go, okay.
So we had a question that we wanted to go back to. Omid, can you read that out?
Yeah, we had one question on a slide earlier. Question was, and folks should be able to see this in the Q&A, are you using quote unquote groups of color as a synonym for black? The commentary expressed confusion about the previous discussion on anti-blackness and felt like it didn't specifically discuss blackness.
Okay, so no, it's not a synonym. People of color is not being used as a synonym for blackness. When we talk about anti-global or global anti-blackness, we're specifically talking about people of color. What's the best way to put this? We're talking about racial and ethnic groups where there is a continuum in the hue of their skin. So for African Americans, I'm African American, I'm Black, I am extremely light skinned, and what I do know is that I have privilege because of the lightness of my skin, and I have children who are very dark skinned, and so the further along the continuum that we go in terms of color or hue of skin towards Blackness or dark skinness, the more challenges and barriers that are experienced. And so that is the focus that we were trying to communicate. Does that clarify things?
Yeah, let us know. It's an anonymous question, so let us know.
Yes, and thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Thank you.
And then just some other comments, some reactions to the video, feeling that it is one way, the way that was described in the video is one way to deal with it, but if he steals all of my sister's wallet all the time, I think I have to call him a thief. I think the conversation works with isolated incidents, but not in all cases.
Yeah, I want to respond to that, because I think that's fabulous that whoever put that in the chat box, because what that underscores is the necessity of really recognizing a pattern of behavior or a pattern of language before we just right out the gate call someone a racist, right? Because ultimately, once you use that language, you shut down all conversation, all ability really to interact. But if your sister's wallet is being stolen every single week, then clearly this person is a thief. If someone is continuing to use discriminatory, oppressive, racist language on a consistent basis, then I think that is foundational enough to say, you know, I think you're a racist, because you actually have a pattern of behavior and pattern of language to point to, rather than an isolated incident, or even an incident that happened this year and then another incident that maybe happened 6 years ago. So I think that bringing out that difference is important. So we're going to, do you want to read anything else from there?
Oh, just some comments that I think we're going to get into right now about how these types of conversations are always easier when there's a relationship between the two people discussing the impact of the microaggression. White culture tends to not start with building relationships, so meetings often just dive into the quote-unquote business of the meeting without getting to know each other a bit first. And that the other last comment was that there also should be a focus on what atmosphere are you building, not just what the person said.
Yeah, that's great.
100% on all of that.
All right, so now we are going to talk about how to respond. Now, this is a response continuum, and you can see that it's been adapted from the LGBTCC interrupting oppressive behavior. And this continuum it's pretty simplistic, but it's helpful, right? And so we start off with the behaviors or characteristics that work against inclusion. You can actively join in the behavior, or you can have no response at all. Now, with the having no response at all, what I want to point out here is this also connects back to how you physically and mentally respond to conflict, all right? So you may find yourself as a bystander, or you may find yourself as the recipient of a microaggression and not have really the physiological ability to respond in that moment. And unfortunately, for those that are around you, if other people are present, that may be experienced as you working against inclusion, or you being complicit in the behavior, because they have no way of actually knowing unless you articulate that you were just unable to speak. But often we're not able to do that in the moment. And then as we move further along towards helping, you educate yourself. Do as much as you can to educate yourself. We know that you know, not moving towards the lens of perfection. That's not where we want to go. But we feel more empowered when we've taken the time to educate ourselves, and we feel like we have some tools in our back pocket that we can actually use, or in our tool bag. And then interrupting the behavior. And when you interrupt the behavior, recognize again that there's a cost-benefit analysis that you have to do in that interruption. Interrupt and educate, and this is a choice that you have. You can simply interrupt the behavior by asking a question, or you can make a statement, and you can choose whether or not to educate and how much education you want to provide, both to the bystanders as well as to the person that engaged in the microaggressive behavior. And then supporting others' proactive responses. I really love this one because I believe that if someone exerts the courage to interrupt, and someone else can support that interruption, then that echoing effect has the power to prevent denial and resistance to the truth that's being experienced by that person who's been the recipient of microaggressive behavior. And then you yourself, you can initiate your own proactive response. And here what I like to underscore is that no one is perfect. All you are being asked to do by yourself, for yourself, is to initiate the response that feels most natural and authentic to you. Yeah, all right. So is responding the right thing? As I said earlier, you have to do a cost-benefit analysis for yourself. We have to think about things like context, like positionality, especially if we're in our workplaces, and if we want to live with whatever the outcome is. What kind of day did you have? Did you wake up, that morning and you had a migraine, or you just felt like things weren't coming together? And have you dealt with microaggressions? The question is this the fifth microaggression you're dealing with? For some of us, we're dealing with microaggressions on a regular basis. And so this may be a day where you're like, I just don't want to deal with it. I don't want to be involved. And that is okay, because it's really about what you need at that time and what you feel most empowered to do. So resist self-judgment. Is the person willing to learn? We don't always know this at the front end, and I think that this also connects to the relationship that you have or the lack thereof. If you get a sense that the person is willing to learn and you feel up to actually educating them, then you can dive into that. Is it worth the stress on you? Only you can make that decision. You know what your capacity is. That's your physical capacity, it's your emotional capacity, it's your mental capacity, and our capacity can change from day to day, from moment to moment. Leaving is an option. You get to not be involved, and you have the right not to respond. And again, I would encourage resisting self-judgment, and I would encourage the rest of us not to judge externally, because we just don't know what's going on for any other person than ourselves in any given moment. I think, were you talking about?
No, I was totally talking about this
yes,
one. Yeah, since we're going from a racial justice lens, I'll talk about when we have privilege. So when we're looking at that previous slide, it can be tempting as a person with privilege to use the same analysis. Like, how am I feeling today? Am I feeling like I have enough to be able to intervene in something? We need to be really aware of our privilege where we have it and use it in order to interrupt microaggressions. So we need to use a little bit different analysis. Often we'll use self-care as a reason not to intervene. And although that's okay, I'll use the example of, say, like my mother died, and a couple months after that, it was pretty hard for me to endure any sort of conflict or really be aware enough of things. But that's the level we're talking about here. Is not, I'm feeling a little off today, so I'm not going to intervene. It's really tempting for me to use those reasons as excuses. So let's try to be real with ourselves and be brave more than we aren't. And then considering the context, balancing what is best for the target and creating forward motion for the agent. So we could have this conversation pretty much for the whole rest of the day, and there have been a lot of online conversations happening around articles that have been posted. But basically, don't not call something out when there are other targets in the room to save face for the agent. So if I'm a white lady and a white lady says something that's harmful to people of color or to a person of color in the room, and there are other people of color in the room, I can use the reason that the other white person who said the microaggressive thing is going to feel really defensive and not move forward. But in doing so, I'm going to be choosing that over mitigating the harm to people of color in the room. So just be aware of those dynamics. And I know people will probably have questions about that because it's a very complex issue. And again, we could talk about it all day, but have that in the back of your mind. If you don't quite get it, talk to someone else who you think might get that concept, and look some stuff up on the internet. In the same way, it's tempting to build community with other folks, and we might feel danger when we call people out because we want to keep that camaraderie, but really fight that feeling of danger, because it's not danger actually at all for us when we have a privilege. And this is, of course, setting aside positionality, like your manager versus you're their employee, right? There are still ways that we can do that, and KJ and I are actually developing some curriculum for supervisors around microaggressions that will talk about some power dynamics. So you still have to think about that, of course, but be honest with yourself about whether or not you're actually in danger, or if you're feeling sad about giving up camaraderie with somebody over their microaggression. And practice being uncomfortable. It's something we don't do very often. Okay, this is all you.
All right. So I'm just going to pull all of these up. Make sure. The last one. Thank you. Whoops. And I did it. All right. So this is not an exhaustive list, a representative list of some strategies that you can use to interrupt microaggressions in action. You can start with asking a question. Tell me more about that. I'm not sure that I understand exactly what you mean. Can you explain? Starting with a question prevents the other person from going on the defense right away. It also gives them an opportunity to think through what they just said, right? You can reframe what they said as a question. Did I hear you correctly when you said A, B, C, and D? What did that mean? Avoiding accusations and inviting clarifications instead of me saying, Lori, you are a racist because you made this statement. I might say, Lori, that statement made me really uncomfortable, and so I want to understand more. Please clarify what you meant when you use this word or when you use this phrase. Name the value dissonance. And this is, let's see, an example of this would be, let's say that I heard Lori making some derogatory statements about those with any level of disability or impairment. I may say to Lori, I'm really surprised to hear you make that statement, given the fact that I know you've done a lot of work in the community with people with like Washington Disability Organization. I'm calling the name of the organization wrong. But, and so there's that value dissonance. Over here, you're doing this great work, and yet I just am hearing you make these microaggressive statements. And so the incongruency is something that we need to discuss. And then pivoting. This is a way of letting people know that they made a mistake in a graceful way. And an example of that could be, we're all in a meeting, Lori makes a statement, and let's give her some positionality. Let's say she is the director and I'm a manager in the meeting, and she's made this statement, I'm really uncomfortable. I may say, Lori, and it doesn't even have to be a meeting. Maybe we're all just sitting around the table and we're just chatting it up. And she made the statement, and so I say, Lori, you know, that there's something about that statement that I'm not quite clear about, and I want to have a conversation with you. I'd like to be able to do that later because I want to continue with the conversation that we're having right now. And so this is a way of pivoting. I let her know that we're going to have this dialogue, but we can stay connected and we can stay in whatever process we're currently in. But now she has the opportunity of preparing herself for a larger conversation. And then educating. Again, this is a choice. You can educate, you can choose to educate or not, but also I like to point out that when you decide to interrupt the microaggression, that there's symbiotic education that's happening. And that education that's taking place is between you and the person that committed a microaggressive behavior, as well as any bystanders. And that education is not just about the historical context or, you know, the definitions of things. It's about it's exempling. It's exempling the language that you use to interrupt. It's exempling, you know, the behavior that you engage in, the response that you have, responding rather than being reactionary. And so we're always educating ourselves and those around us. We just have to raise our awareness so we recognize that that education is actually taking place. Now, use humor when appropriate. If you have teenagers and they tell you you're funny, you can believe them. All right. If your spouse tells you, or your partner tells you, or your significant other tells you that you're funny, you can probably believe them as well. If they tell you you're not funny, you should believe them, and do not use humor because it can go left. But humor is a great way to break the ice. And often we engage in humor because of our anxiety, right? We'll start giggling or laughing, or we'll chuckle, and that can be taken the wrong way. So you want to be careful with humor. But if you are someone that is naturally humorous and that comes out of you on a regular basis, then you're probably going to engage in that in a very natural way anyway. But again, raise your awareness so that you are so that you're more aware of your context and those that are present, and whether or not humor is the right vehicle to use in that moment. And then going back to echoing again, it is powerful to be the first voice that interrupts bias, but it's even more powerful when that first voice is joined by other voices who engage in the act of courage to support. And then using those I statements so that we're not automatically putting the other person on the defense, right? And considering the relationship as well. If I'm using I statements, then it's much more likely that Lori and I are going to be able to have a true dialogue and come to that place of collaboration, because I'm focused on the things that I can control. I'm focused on the way I feel, and I'm focused on the words that I'm using. And so I'm not using you and pointing at you, which may make Lori feel attacked.
So I will insert here, as a white woman, what I'm really tempted to do with KJ's words during this last section. So as a white lady, I am tempted to say, you know, you called me out and you did not make use of I statements. And I really would have heard what you had to say if you had used I statements or asked me a question about my microaggression. So my point being that these are great ways that you can show up and maybe make these situations less tense. They are not what's expected of marginalized individuals who are receiving your microaggression. So avoid that temptation to only hear people who interrupt you in beautiful and loving ways, right? Because we're talking about people who you've done something offensive to. And I want to own that. I'm going to own that when I create that harm. And I'm not going to not own it because somebody didn't call me out the right way.
Yep, absolutely.
Do you want me to take this?
I think you're
section
gonna have
so
to
you
take
can,
this.
all right,
Yes,
let's do it.
all right. Thank you all
we
very
so sadly
much.
have to say goodbye to
Yes,
KJ. KJ needs to
yes.
run off.
Thank you very much. I hope that what I've shared so far has been helpful.
I'll see you soon. See you soon. Yeah, for sure. All right, and I wish we had more time for this section, but we will go through it quickly. And if you have questions, I'll be on for a little bit after we're done. So if you can stick around, I can answer some questions for you. We are going to go right into responding better to being interrupted. So this is when you have said something microaggressive to somebody and they've said, hey, you know, that was racist, or that hurt my feelings. They might have asked you questions or used I statements, or they may not have. But first thing you're going to do is feel defensive. So refrain from defensiveness and instead access your parasympathetic nervous system. We skipped over a little bit of our information about this, but basically when you go into fight or flight mode, when your body senses conflict, you're sent into a different part of your brain that cannot function. It cannot think well. It cannot hear well. So you're not going to hear what the other person is saying. If you just take a couple of deep breaths, it's going to reconnect you to your parasympathetic nervous system. You're going to be able to hear better and make better decisions. After you have slowed down a little bit and accessed that parasympathetic nervous system, ask the person to repeat what they've said so that you can really hear them. If you're feeling tearful, this is an important one. It's a lot of you probably heard the term white tears. if you're feeling tearful and you need to leave in order to take care of your emotions, it's okay to do that. It's okay to say, you know, I need a minute, and leave the room. And it's important that we do this as privileged folks, because if we stay with our tears in front of the person that we've harmed, they're going to want to take care of us. They're going to feel like they have to take care of us, and we're going to be further burdening them. So of course you're going to feel things, because we're human beings, even though we are human beings with privilege. And we need to make our tears not the other person's responsibility after we've harmed them. Resist the urge to explain your intent. But I meant it as a compliment is a huge one that we say after we've said a microaggression. It doesn't really matter what we meant it as if it creates harm. So we have to remember that yes, we came at this from good intentions and still it created harm. You know what I meant? It's another one we say a lot. Or I wouldn't have taken it that way. They're just being sensitive. We wouldn't have taken it that way because we have privilege. So our identity works very differently in this society than theirs does. And then acknowledge the impact. Take responsibility. Say, I'm sorry, and I'm sorry you felt offended is not an apology. A good one to remember. I have to remind my wife of that sometimes. I'm sorry we're fighting. I hate that one. It's the worst. Don't explain why you said it. Do it later with someone else. So this is an important one too. It's important for us as people with privilege to work through the things that we've said that have been harmful, and to understand where it's coming from, but it's important to do with somebody else, not the person who we've just offended. And I will say also, it's good to not do that with another friend who shares that identity of the person we've offended. So say I've said something racist to my Black friends, I'm not gonna then go to my other Black friend and say, I said this terrible thing. I'm gonna go to a white friend who's gonna hold me accountable, who's also working on showing up in anti-racist ways, and we'll talk through it. And it's really important if you are a white person or a straight person working on your homophobia, or an able person working on your ableism, that we're going to people who share our privileged identities who are also working on these things. And this is how we're going to build community in ways that'll keep us accountable. Listening, practice active listening. I know there are a lot of lawyers on the call, and we tend to, when someone is talking, we tend to build our case while they're talking. Like, aha, I have a defense for that thing that that person just said. Really try to listen without building your case while you're listening, and give space for the other person. Don't just active listen, but let that person's words influence your perspective. It's a really important one. Oh, predatory listening. I knew I had it on there. That's the thing where you're listening for the thing that you can counter with an argument instead of actually listening. And then repair. So apologize for real, not I'm sorry you were offended. Ask what you can do to rectify the relational damage. And be okay with not receiving an answer. Sometimes you won't have a relationship where someone wants to invest, and that has to be okay, because like we talked about before, marginalized individuals get to decide how much energy they're going to put into helping repair the situation. And then thank the person for taking the time and energy to share with you, which I know might feel like a stretch, but you'll get there. Like once you can frame it for yourself as, this is something helpful that someone's done for me. I now understand that that thing is harmful that I've been saying, and now I won't do it anymore. That's a gift. And we spoke about this briefly, but you're gonna have feelings as a privileged person who said something that has hurt someone. But we don't wanna make those feelings the job of the person who we've offended. So pack them up, pack up those feelings, take them with you, talk to a friend about it, build relationships that keep you accountable, and don't make it the target's job to make you feel better. And then don't carry that forever, because it's not going to help you. We have a lot of guilt as privileged people, most of us do. It's good in that it reminds us that we need to be better, but forgive yourself and move on, because I'm going to create another microaggression tomorrow, and I need to be there and have all my wits about me for that. I'm guessing there are some questions, Omid. Am I correct about that?
Yeah, with the few minutes we have left, folks who are willing to stay, we'll just take any questions folks have. One that we have already, it came in earlier, was one that I'll just read off. It says, when collaborating at work, should positionality be the same? So how do you collaborate between, let's say, managers and employees? Do they collaborate together? Do you collaborate separately? How do you navigate that? Or would there be an instance where you would suspend that positionality?
Yes, it would be amazing if we could suspend that positionality. The reality is, I don't think we have been successful in very many work environments in having anything but a very tried and true hierarchy. So I think it's a culture issue within workplaces, and it's actually something that KJ and I will probably be developing more content around. For now, I think collaboration can happen among different levels in a hierarchy, but yes, it's very challenging, and it does make it murky when we're adding that to all the different identities and power structures that we have around identity.
And this is Omid, and you know, I've been thinking about this question since it came in, because it is a really, oh, here's my face, everyone.
This is what Omid looks like.
For folks who are doing that work, you know, someone said it earlier, what is the culture, what is the environment we're creating? Well, what are we valuing in our personal development and our own understanding of what our relationship is with both privilege and marginalization? If that can be that committed value within a team, within a workspace, within an organizational culture, then there can be a better chance, a fighting chance for the relationships to get built, and also for those conversations to happen in ways that can navigate that positionality and navigate positional authority and roles. It will still be challenging, but I think where I have seen it work are those who are committed to doing that personal work, who understand why that's important, and so then those conversations can still happen while both sides or all sides are figuring out how to navigate kind of the default hierarchy that all of our organizations are dealing with by just living in a hierarchical society. So those are my 2 cents there. I don't see any other questions coming through. We just want to thank everyone for joining us today. Big thank you to Lori and KJ. We're going to send a follow-up email to anyone who registered for today's webinar. It's going to have information on how to view this recording on demand. If you want to view it again, it's going to have CLE info, other resources, and different ways to stay connected with both Reggie and also Lori and KJ. So thank you all. Have a great rest of your day. Hope everyone's rest of their week is one that is thriving and in your power. So appreciate everyone.
Bye. Thanks all. You got it.